So I'm going to demonstrate a technique to you guys called edge extrusion modeling. And the first thing I want to introduce really quickly before we start any of that is shift dragging in 3ds Max. A lot of people have gotten caught up on this in our previous tutorials, so I'm going to go over it real quick. When you're in the object mode, right, when you've got a whole object selected, if you shift and drag, right, it'll create a copy or an instance or a reference, which I'll explain in a little bit. Generally this will happen in sub-object as well. If you pick, say, I'll just convert this to poly. If you were to pick a polygon, right, and shift drag that, it just creates a copy of the polygon, which, you know, that makes sense. If you same deal with an element, if you pick the element, it'll copy it in within the same object to an element. I'm pretty sure it'll do it for a vertex as well, but nobody ever needs to do that, to be honest. Okay, so the one case where it differs is if you have a hole in the mesh, some open edges, which is what we'll call it. I'm just going to quickly turn off backface drawing by clicking backface cull, and then you can see Max isn't lying to us about where any of the geometry is. So you can see a clean hole there. If I border select that just to pick all the open edges, or if I was to select a single edge, right? If I shift drag with this, right, it's actually going to create geometry as I move that selection of edges away. I can do it with pretty much any selection of these edges as well, and it will actually create the geometry as it goes. Okay, that's the basic technique, and we're going to do that to create pretty much a whole object. So we're going to start setting up reference images. What I've got here is just like a little drawing of a hammerhead shark that I just quickly did for the purpose. It's only two views, but you'll notice that the image is square in dimensions. It's like a 1-to-1 aspect ratio. I find that's pretty handy when you're using reference images, because what it means is I can drag out a plane as to put the reference images on, and I can set that to any size in units that I want, as long as it's just the same number twice. So if I had, you know, like 120 by 100 and I decided I wanted to make it a little bit smaller, I'd have to do some maths in my head to figure out what dimensions to put in, whereas with a square image I can just put in the same number twice and the aspect ratio is going to be fine, which will really matter if you're doing something like cars or guns or whatever that have circles on them. So as you just saw, you can just drag an image out of the Explorer window onto the plane and it'll texture it with that. I'm going to move it back a little bit just so that I've got room in the center for the actual model to sit in. So anyway, what I'm doing, which is kind of different to what a lot of people do, is I'm going to have all the reference views on one image plane. I find this works better for me. That's what I do when I work. You can decide what works better for you after trying both, I guess. I'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages as I go through. I'm going to just set this to shaded. So it doesn't have ambient occlusion and all that kind of stuff happening to sort of distract this. I'm going to turn off grids as well. I'm going to turn off the grid up here and set this to shaded as well, so I can actually see the image. So there's our reference plane set up, and I guess we can get started on blocking things out now. Okay, so the way I generally model is I'll actually have multiple copies of the actual object I'm making. I'm going to start with just a box for this one, just to give us some geometry. What I'm going to do is, because when you create a box, as you might see, the pivot point starts over on the edge there. I'm just going to center it by going into the hierarchy tab, effect pivot, center to object, and then I'm going to see how this is actually offset from the center as well, because it was placed where the actual origin was. I'm just going to set this to 0 so that it's in the absolute middle of the scene, and this is just to give us some starting geometry that we can start extruding edges from. I'm going to add a turbo smooth modifier to it and maybe crank it up to to 2. This is just so we have some nice clean quad based like a big chunky blob in the middle to start off the shape of the actual model. So like I was saying, I do things a little bit differently to what a lot of tutorials will show. I'm sure there are other people that use this technique, but I don't see it come up a whole bunch. We're going to just be using the one image plane and multiple copies of the same object. So we're going to shift drag this down we're going to set this one to an instance. We kind of went into what instances do before. You want your snap toggle on to do this, and obviously because this is just a drag down copy, we need to rotate it so that it's actually appropriately oriented to, to use as a top down ref rather than a side on ref. So I'll just turn that down 90 degrees. And now, because they're instances, I can go into vertex mode, and a really cool thing about this is I can have a whole window here, and I can start scaling this up, scaling it out to the side to make the guy a little bit chunkier, and it's updating down there, as you can see. And if you take a look there, it's actually a pretty good first shot at it, but I can just scale it to whatever size I wanted and stuff. So it might not be obvious why I do this differently with the instances of objects, but if you get into a situation where you have a whole bunch of different references, like say, for example, you were doing like a tank or whatever, and you had a whole bunch of like 3 views or top-down, side view, that kind of thing, and you had like a bigger version, or like a zoomed-in picture of like the sprocket or like one of the wheels or something, or a track maybe, you can just instance the object, and it can be any size. You can just scale it, and you don't have to line any of the references up. See, I mean, these could be totally misaligned from each other. The top view could be over here on the image somewhere, and all I'd have to do would line up the actual model. But the downside is, if I was, which I'm going to do, I'm going to apply an FFD to this. If we don't know about FFDs, this should show what they do. It's a modifier, and what it does is it'll create a little lattice. I'm using a 3x3 one, which means it has 1, 2, 3 segments in all directions. So I can grab these control points, right, and modify it as if it's a really simplified like little box mesh. And I'm just going to drag this out to sort of give a good starting shape, like sort of approximate the core mass of this shark, I guess. You can see it's applying down on the bottom one as well, but I'll show you what goes wrong in a minute. I'm going to grab the top ones and make them a little bit thinner, because sharks tend to be round at the bottom, and you can sort of see what's going on there with the shading there towards the dorsal. They get a bit thinner. So that basic shape I'm fairly happy with, and what I'm going to do is collapse all. So now it's committed, all changes into the editable poly, right? But I'll show you what goes wrong. If I grab these and say delete them, so that I have an open edge to start edge extruding from, like in the first example I showed you guys earlier on, you'll notice it doesn't update here, and that's because it's no longer an instance. It's still got the modifier on it. If you collapse a modifier, it will lose its status as an instance if it is an instance. So a way to, I mean, you could fix that obviously by just dragging it down again and repositioning it as an instance. But you can also write a little bit of script to get around it, which I'll show you how to do right now.